When I bought the old farmhouse, I thought I'd escape the nightmare of HOA politics for good. I wanted peace, open land, creaking floors, and the sound of wind in the trees instead of neighbor complaints. But just 2 weeks after I moved in, a woman from the neighboring subdivision marched up my gravel driveway, claiming the house was hers. The strangest part, she had paperwork, real documents. And that was only the beginning. What would you do if someone tried to steal your home legally? The farmhouse sat on 5 acres of land, surrounded by rusted wire fencing and tall, whispering cornfields. It had been abandoned for decades, a ghost on the edge of a modern suburb that was expanding fast, too fast. When I first saw the "for sale" sign, I felt like I was standing at the border between two worlds. To the east, there were freshly paved streets, cookie cutter houses, and mailbox clusters stamped with HOA logos. To the west, fields stretched to the horizon. My farmhouse stood right between them, caught in time. The place was falling apart, roof sagging, shutters hanging, porch steps eaten by termites. But I saw history in every board. I wanted to restore it, not flip it, not modernize it, but bring it back to the way it looked when it was built, more than 120 years ago. I closed the deal in early spring. The land didn't fall under any homeowners association. The nearest HOA boundary stopped 100 yards away, across the creek that marked my property line. I even double-checked the county maps. No restrictions, no bylaws, no petty committee members peering over fences. For the first time in years, I felt free. The first week was chaos. I hauled debris, scrubbed mold, tore down rotted beams. The farmhouse smelled like dust and history. Every night I slept on an air mattress by the fireplace, listening to crickets outside and the faint hum of cars from the new neighborhood down the road. I could see their porch lights through the trees, neat little boxes glowing in perfect rows. I was glad I didn't belong there. By week 2, I'd replaced half the windows and started painting the siding. That's when I saw her for the first time. She was standing across the creek, arms crossed, watching me. Mid-50s maybe, short blonde hair, crisp pastel sweater, the exact kind of person you'd picture handing out HOA violation slips. At first, I thought she was just curious. I waved. She didn't wave back. She just turned and walked away. The next morning, I found a note taped to my gate. No envelope, just bold, blocky handwriting. This property falls under Maple Grove Estates HOA jurisdiction. You are required to attend the next meeting to discuss compliance. I laughed out loud. There was no way. I wasn't part of any HOA. The creek was the boundary. I knew that for a fact. I threw the note in the trash and went back to work. 2 days later, I noticed orange flags marking the edge of my land. Small plastic ones with HOA boundary review printed on them. Someone had planted them overnight. That same afternoon, the woman came again. She didn't cross the creek this time. She just stood there shouting something I couldn't hear over the hammering. When I finally looked up, she was holding a folder in one hand, gesturing toward the house like she owned it. I called out to her, asking what she wanted, but she just turned away again and left. That night, I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't the first time I dealt with difficult neighbors, but something about her persistence felt official. Like she truly believed she had authority over me. The next morning, I drove to the county assessor's office to check everything again. The clerk pulled up the parcel records and confirmed what I already knew: my property was outside the HOA. No liens, no shared easements, no disputes, clean ownership. When I got home, there were tire marks on the driveway. Fresh ones. My gate was open. Inside, nothing seemed stolen, but someone had been there. My toolboxes were moved, and a few old family photos I'd found in the attic were laid out on the kitchen counter, like someone had been studying them. On top of the stack was another note. You don't belong here. Bah. The handwriting was the same. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing creaks on the porch, like footsteps. The farmhouse groaned in the wind, the kind of sound that could almost convince you the walls were alive. Every so often, headlights passed on the distant road, brief flashes of light slicing through the dark. I started thinking about who that woman was. Maybe she wasn't from the HOA at all. Maybe she had some personal connection to this place. A relative of the original owners, maybe. That would explain the fixation, the notes, the way she looked at the house like she recognized it. The next day, while clearing the overgrown backyard, I found something buried near the tree line. A half-rotted wooden sign, painted white, with fading black letters. Henderson Farm East, 1903. When I brought it inside, I noticed initials carved into the back, MMH. I didn't think much of it until later that evening, when I decided to look up the property's history online. The Henderson family had owned the farmhouse for nearly a century before it went into foreclosure. The last recorded owner before me was Margaret Henderson. My stomach turned cold when I realized the woman's name on the HOA note had been signed Margaret H. Maple Grove Board. It couldn't be a coincidence. Maybe she was a descendant. Maybe she wasn't over losing the property, but trying to claim it as hers. That was something else entirely. Over the next few days, her harassment escalated. She started showing up almost every morning, standing just beyond the creek, sometimes with other neighbors from Maple Grove behind her. They'd point at the house, whisper, take pictures. One day, I saw her hand out what looked like printed flyers to the group, and by that evening, a local Facebook group for the area was flooded with posts calling me a squatter and claiming I was illegally occupying community land. It spread fast. Strangers drove by just to take photos. Someone even left trash in my driveway, a mock eviction notice scrawled on cardboard. I tried reasoning with the county again, but they told me it was a civil issue. Probably just a boundary misunderstanding, they said. But this didn't feel like a misunderstanding. It felt like a campaign. And then one morning, it got worse. I woke up to the sound of engines, heavy machinery rumbling outside. When I stepped onto the porch, my jaw dropped. There were men in bright vests unloading fencing panels from a truck marked with the HOA's logo. They were driving steel posts into the ground on my side of the creek. I shouted for them to stop, but they claimed they had authorization. They said this area was being zoned into the HOA district and that Henderson had signed off on it. I demanded to see paperwork. They refused. I called the sheriff's department. By the time a deputy arrived, half the fence was already up. Margaret was standing there with a clipboard, smiling like she'd already won. When the deputy questioned her, she pulled out printed maps, documents I'd never seen before, showing the property line moved 50 feet west, cutting straight through my land. The deputy looked unsure. He said it would need to be reviewed by the county surveyor, but until then, he couldn't force them to remove the fence. I felt powerless. By sunset, I was trapped behind steel fencing, like a prisoner in my own yard. That night, I sat by the fire and watched headlights flicker from the Maple Grove subdivision. Laughter drifted across the creek, faint, mocking, distant. I looked around the old farmhouse and tried to imagine what it had been through in 120 years. How many people had fought to keep it standing? How many had been forced to give it up? But as the firelight flickered against the peeling walls, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going anywhere. Still, a question haunted me. If she had those documents, where did she get them? And how could she make the county maps look like I didn't exist? That thought stayed with me long into the night, right up until I heard the sound of footsteps on my porch again. Slow, deliberate, too heavy to be the wind. I grabbed my flashlight and swung the beam toward the door, and froze. Someone had nailed a new sign to my front door, white letters on black wood. I tore the sign down and ran to the road, but there was no one there, only the echo of footsteps fading into the dark. That's when I realized this wasn't just harassment. Someone was rewriting the boundaries of my land, and by morning, I might not even legally own my own house. The next morning, fog hung low over the fields, thick enough to blur the fence line. The air smelled like wet earth and rust. When I stepped outside, the steel fence glistened with dew, stretching across my yard like a scar. The sign I'd ripped down the night before was gone, replaced by a small laminated tag zip tied to one of the new posts. It had a barcode and a serial number, like something you'd see on official city property. I felt sick. I'd bought this land fair and square, with a clean title, paid taxes, and confirmed records. Yet here I was, standing in the yard of a house that might not legally belong to me anymore, all because of a woman who refused to accept boundaries. I spent that morning photographing everything: the fence, the signs, the machinery tracks. I wanted proof for when I went back to the county. But the more photos I took, the more unsettling details I noticed. The fencing didn't just follow the creek, it snaked deeper into my yard, weaving behind the barn and around the old oak tree where I'd found the Henderson sign. It was as if someone had deliberately redrawn the perimeter to cut off the most valuable part of my land, the section with the well and the newly restored barn. By mid-morning, I drove to the county office again. I showed the clerk my pictures, my deed, my survey map. She frowned and pulled up the digital records. When she turned the screen toward me, my stomach dropped. The map was different. The boundary line, the one that used to stop at the creek, now extended westward, exactly as the HOA's fence did. My entire east field and half my barn were shaded in blue, labeled Maple Grove Estates, Section 7 Expansion. It made no sense. These things took months to process, years even. Yet the digital records had been altered overnight. The clerk looked uneasy. She said she'd have to talk to her supervisor. When she returned, she handed me a printed notice, a zoning adjustment petition, filed 3 days earlier, and at the bottom of the form was a signature, Margaret Henderson. Under position authority, it read Chair, Maple Grove Land Committee. My name wasn't mentioned anywhere. That was the moment I realized how deep this went. She wasn't just a neighbor with an obsession. She had access, influence, maybe even connections inside the county office itself. On my drive home, I couldn't shake the thought that she'd planned this long before I ever moved in. Maybe she'd been waiting for someone to buy the farmhouse. Maybe she'd been waiting for me. When I pulled into the driveway, there was a white SUV parked near the gate. A man in a collared shirt was taking photos of my house with a clipboard in hand. He introduced himself as a property inspector for Maple Grove Compliance. He said he was there to evaluate the structure for neighborhood integration. I told him to leave immediately. He gave me a polite smile, like I'd just failed a test, and drove off slowly, snapping one last photo of my front porch. That night, I felt like every light in the farmhouse was being watched. I tried to distract myself with renovation work, fixing a loose step, sanding down an old window frame. But every creak of the house made my skin crawl. I could almost feel her eyes on me from across the creek, waiting for the moment I'd give up. But I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. I decided to dig deeper, literally. If Margaret Henderson was somehow related to the family that built this house, maybe there was something left behind that connected her to the property. Something she was trying to reclaim. So the next morning, I started searching the attic again, the same place I'd found the old photos weeks earlier. The air was thick with dust, sunlight cutting through the cracks in narrow beams. I found boxes filled with yellowed papers, receipts, and a few handwritten ledgers. Most of them were farming records, but one folder caught my eye. It was labeled MPL Girovili TUST 1952. Inside were maps, hand-drawn brittle, with property lines that matched the old boundaries, not the new ones. I traced them with my finger. The farmhouse was clearly outside the shaded area, but stapled to the back of the map was a letter. The paper was fragile, almost translucent with age. The letter was dated 1953 and signed by M. Henderson. It stated that the parcel west of the creek shall remain exempt from the association's jurisdiction indefinitely. By agreement of the founding trustees. My heart pounded. This was it. Proof. Decades old, that my property was never meant to be part of the OA. I spent the rest of the day scanning and backing up everything. If Margaret had somehow manipulated records, this could expose her. But before I could celebrate, something strange happened. Around sunset, my power flickered. Then the lights went out completely. The house went silent, except for the faint hum of crickets outside. I stepped onto the porch with my flashlight and saw headlights at the far end of the driveway. A truck idled there, engine running, no one getting out. Then, slowly it backed away and disappeared down the road. The next morning, the power company confirmed the outage had been caused by scheduled maintenance. Yet there were no records of any crews in my area. It didn't feel like coincidence. I drove into town to file a formal complaint with the sheriff's office. The deputy on duty listened carefully but didn't seem surprised. He said, I wasn't the first to have trouble with Maple Grove's HOA board. They'd been accused before of aggressive boundary enforcement, even harassment, but they always found a way to make the evidence disappear. He promised to keep an eye out. That wasn't enough for me. When I got back to the farmhouse that afternoon, A new notice was taped to the fence, HOA Karma Chronicles ownership review. According to the document, a public hearing would be held in 1 week to determine rightful possession of parcel 47B, which was my property. My name wasn't listed anywhere on the notice. Only applicant, Maple Grove Estates HOA. They were trying to take my home officially. For the next few days, I barely slept. I printed copies of every document I had, the deed, the 1953 exemption letter, the photos. I even hired a private surveyor to measure the boundaries. He confirmed the obvious: the HOA fence was built 39 feet beyond its legal limit. But when he filed his report with the county, it mysteriously vanished from the system the next day. Every move I made was being shadowed. Every piece of evidence seemed to vanish before it could matter. One evening, while sitting by the fire, I thought about the house's history again. Margaret Henderson, the original Henderson family. The strange way her documents seemed so official. I wondered if she was even truly part of the HOA, or if she was the HOA. Maybe she'd created the whole system decades ago, and Maple Grove was built on the same land her family once owned. That would explain the obsession. It wasn't just about me, it was about control. About rewriting history to make sure no one ever took her land again. The night before the hearing, I heard something outside again. This time, not just footsteps, voices. I turned off the lights and looked through the window. Several people were standing by the new fence, flashlights sweeping across my yard. I couldn't see faces, just silhouettes. They moved methodically, like they were searching for something. Then I noticed what they were doing, removing the old boundary markers I'd placed years ago when I bought the land. They were erasing the evidence. I grabbed my phone and started recording through the window, zooming in on their shapes. One of them turned, and the light caught her face. It was Margaret, calm, smiling, directing the others like a foreman. They left after half an hour. I waited until the engines faded before stepping outside. The night was cold and silent. I walked to the edge of the property and saw that every single marker, every stake, every ribbon was gone. In their place were fresh metal signs: private HOA property, no trespassing. When I tried to pull one out of the ground, I realized it wasn't just hammered in. It was cemented, permanent. By sunrise, I'd made my decision. I was going to the hearing. Not as a victim, but with proof. I had the old letter, the maps, the photos, and a backup drive full of records. If they wanted to take this public, I'd expose everything. I didn't know then that walking into that meeting would change everything, because when I showed up, the entire board was already waiting, and sitting at the center of the table, with her hands folded neatly on a stack of files, was Margaret Henderson. But something was different. She looked calm, triumphant, like she already knew I'd lost. When I sat down, she smiled faintly and pushed a folder toward me. I hesitated before opening it, and what I saw inside made my stomach drop. It was a title transfer. My farmhouse, my land. Dated yesterday. Signed. Not by me, but by someone using my full name and forged signature. And at the bottom, the county's notary stamp, verified. My hands went cold as I stared at the papers. She'd done it. Somehow. She'd made it look like I'd sold her the house. And when I looked up at her across that table, she whispered something I couldn't hear, but I didn't need to. I knew what that smile meant. By law, I didn't own the farmhouse anymore. But I wasn't leaving. Not yet. Because the farmhouse had secrets, and I was about to uncover something Margaret Henderson never wanted anyone to find. $1,030,000 suitudes off the. The moment I saw my forged signature, something inside me snapped. The room spun. My own name stared back at me from a document that should never have existed, stamped and notarized by someone I'd never met. Margaret's faint smile never wavered. She sat perfectly still, as if watching a performance she'd rehearsed 1,000 times. I wanted to yell, to demand answers, but I stayed silent. Every instinct told me that she wanted me to lose control, that she'd built this entire illusion so any reaction could be used against me. Instead, I studied the document. The date was recent. Too recent. It was filed just hours before the hearing. That meant someone in the county office had pushed it through overnight. It wasn't just her. She had help, maybe even people inside the system. When the hearing began, I listened as she presented her case like a well-practiced attorney. She spoke about historical land recovery, restoration of rightful ownership, and protection of community heritage. She even called the farmhouse a vital cultural site that had been misappropriated. Every sentence was wrapped in formality, backed by printed forms and stamped papers that all looked legitimate. But I knew the truth. Every piece of it was forged. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up and laid the original 1953 exemption letter on the table. The old paper looked fragile next to her glossy files, but it was real. I explained its significance, pointed out the signatures, and traced the hand-drawn map that clearly marked the creek as the permanent boundary. I expected confusion, debate, maybe even shock. Instead, the room went silent. The chairperson, a thin man with silver hair and a Maple Grove pin on his lapel, cleared his throat and said the document was historically interesting but non-binding. He claimed the HOA had been rechartered multiple times since 1953, rendering previous exemptions obsolete. The other board members nodded along like a chorus. Margaret sat there, calm and composed, watching me unravel. She didn't even need to speak anymore. The board was doing her work for her. When the session adjourned, they didn't give me a verdict. They said it would be under review, but I could see it in their eyes. It was already decided. I left the meeting hall feeling hollow. Outside, the air was thick with humidity and the low hum of cicadas. The courthouse steps felt heavier than ever beneath my boots. I looked across the street and saw her standing there, Margaret, under a lamppost, talking quietly with the county clerk. They both glanced at me, then turned away. That was when I knew this wasn't a fight I could win through paperwork. That night, I sat in the farmhouse with the lights off, staring at the flickering shadows cast by the fireplace. My thoughts twisted like the smoke curling toward the ceiling. If she had gone this far, what was next? What was she trying to hide behind all these legal tricks? There had to be a reason she wanted this house so badly. Then I remembered the maps I'd found in the attic, the ones labeled with the old trust. They showed more than just property lines. There were symbols on the far edge of my land, near the barn, small X and notes in faded ink that I hadn't paid attention to before. Maybe they marked something. Maybe that's what she wanted. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the night. The air was damp and cold. The fence loomed in the darkness like a cage, reflecting silver in the moonlight. I followed the line of the barn and through the high grass toward the trees where the markings had been drawn. The ground was uneven, thick with roots and old stones. I nearly tripped over something buried just below the surface, a patch of disturbed soil. Kneeling, I brushed away the dirt until I felt the edge of wood. It wasn't a tree root or debris. It was a box. I dug with my hands until I could lift it free. The box was old, maybe as old as the farmhouse itself, the wood soft and dark from moisture. The hinges were rusted, but it opened with a groan that echoed through the still night. Inside was a stack of papers wrapped in waxed cloth and a small brass key. The documents were handwritten, some dated as far back as the early 1900s, and at the top of the pile was a letter addressed to future Henderson custodian. I read by flashlight, my heart hammering harder with every line. The letter explained that the farmhouse and its surrounding acres were never meant to be incorporated into any modern development. The land had been part of a private trust set up by the original Henderson patriarch, one that legally prevented its sale or subdivision without a specific heir's approval. If that trust still existed, it could override every claim Margaret had. But there was more. The letter mentioned a hidden ledger stored inside the farmhouse itself. Something about proof of transfer, buried within one of the walls during the second renovation in the 1950s. Suddenly, everything made sense. Margaret wasn't just trying to claim the house. She was trying to destroy the proof that it never belonged to her. I raced back toward the farmhouse, clutching the papers like they were gold. Inside, I pulled furniture away from the walls, scanning the paneling for seams or hollow spots. The house seemed to breathe with me, every creak like a whisper urging me forward. In the living room, beneath a section of old plaster, I found it. A narrow gap that sounded hollow when I knocked. I pried it open with a crowbar. Behind the wall was a small tin container. Inside, there was a book, a faded leather ledger with hundreds of names and signatures. My eyes locked onto one of Margaret Henderson, 1984. Next to it, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Trust suspended, to be reinstated only upon rightful inheritance." Below that, Another line caught my eye. Fraudulent filings voided pending confirmation of heir. I didn't know much about legal language, but that sounded like the key to everything. Margaret wasn't the heir. She'd tried to claim the trust decades ago and been denied. That's why she was rewriting history, and why she needed my land to complete the illusion. As I flipped through the pages, I noticed a final entry dated only a few years before I bought the property. Custodial transfer authorized upon sale outside HOA limits. My signature wasn't there, but the implication was clear. Whoever had sold me the farmhouse had unknowingly passed me the legal position of custodian. By buying it, I'd inherited the rights Margaret had been chasing for years. I was shaking with adrenaline, with anger, with disbelief. But before I could process what I'd found, my flashlight flickered and died. The room plunged into darkness. I heard it then, the crunch of gravel outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps approaching the porch. I held my breath. The boards creaked under the weight of someone climbing the steps. Then a shadow passed across the window, followed by a faint tapping on the glass. Once, twice, then silence. I didn't move. After what felt like hours, the sound of footsteps faded, replaced by the distant hum of a car engine starting. I waited until I was sure she was gone before turning the lights back on. In the morning, I called a lawyer, one recommended by the sheriff's deputy I'd met earlier. I didn't tell her everything, just enough to get her attention. When I mentioned the trust and the ledger, she asked me to bring everything immediately. She said, if the trust was legitimate, it could nullify any modern deed transfer. But before I could even leave, I heard a vehicle pull up outside. Through the window, I saw two black SUVs parked near the fence. Men in suits stepped out, carrying briefcases and clipboards. They didn't look like contractors or county workers. They looked like lawyers. And standing behind them, perfectly poised as always, was Margaret. She watched as the men began photographing my house again, measuring the fence, marking spots in the dirt. It was like watching vultures circle a dying animal. I stepped out onto the porch and shouted across the yard, demanding they leave. Margaret didn't respond. She just smiled, then turned to one of the men and said something I couldn't hear. Moments later, one of them approached with a document in hand. He said they were there to initiate repossession proceedings based on the title transfer. He claimed I was unlawfully occupying HOA property. I told him the property was under legal dispute, that I had proof of fraud. He didn't care. He just handed me a notice stamped with the HOA's seal and said they'd be back in 48 hours to secure the premises. I stood there, shaking, watching them drive away. The farmhouse, once a dream of freedom, now felt like a ticking clock counting down to its own erasure. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the ledger and the trust papers spread out before me. The brass key from the buried box lay beside them, glinting in the dim light. I didn't know what it opened, but I had a feeling it mattered. There was one more secret left to uncover, something even Margaret hadn't found. I remembered a trapdoor in the basement I'd never been able to open. The lock had rusted shut years ago. I grabbed the key and a lantern, descended the creaking stairs, and found the hatch in the corner beneath the old furnace. My hands trembled as I slid the brass key into the lock. It turned easily, like it had been waiting all this time. The hatch creaked open, releasing a wave of cold air that smelled of earth and iron. Inside was a narrow tunnel lined with stone, leading deeper beneath the house. I climbed down, lantern trembling in my hand. The walls were carved with initials, Henderson, over and over, in different handwriting. And at the end of the tunnel, a small iron door. On the door was a plaque. The words were faded but still readable. Henderson Family Trust. Custodian's Archive. My breath caught. I reached for the handle, but before I could pull, I heard footsteps again, this time inside the house above me. Heavy, slow, methodical. The sound of doors opening and closing, boots scraping across the floor. Someone was in the farmhouse. I froze in the darkness, lantern shaking in my hand. The footsteps moved closer, stopping directly above the basement hatch. Dust rained down as the boards creaked under the intruder's weight. Then, a single word echoed through the floorboards. My name, soft, deliberate, and unmistakable. It was her voice. Margaret was inside the farmhouse. And she wasn't alone. The sound of my name drifted down through the floorboards again, drawn out, deliberate, like a thread of smoke curling through the dark. My pulse hammered so hard it drowned the creak of the lantern in my hand. I stared up at the ceiling, every muscle locked. Whoever was up there was moving slowly, testing each step, as if they already knew exactly where I was hiding. The basement air was cold and damp, thick with the smell of clay and rust. I killed the lantern and stood in darkness. My own breath sounded too loud, so I forced myself to take shallow, quiet gulps of air. The footsteps stopped. For a few seconds the house was silent. Then something metallic scraped above me, the hinge of the trapdoor. I backed into the tunnel, pressing my hand against the stone wall. The brass key bit into my palm. I could feel the faint hum of the old furnace above me, and the soft vibration of a second pair of feet now entering the room. More than one person. Margaret hadn't come alone. A faint beam of light sliced through the crack around the trapdoor. Dust floated down in golden specks. A man's voice murmured something I couldn't make out. And then the light disappeared. The sound of the hatch closing echoed, like thunder through the basement. They were upstairs now, moving from room to room, drawers opening, cabinets shutting. Heavy thuds as furniture scraped against the floor. They were searching for something, and I was fairly sure I knew what. I relit the lantern, shielding the flame with my hand, and turned back toward the iron door at the end of the tunnel. The plate gleamed faintly in the light. Henderson Family Trust, Custodian's Archive. The brass key felt almost warm now, as though it recognized its lock. When I slid it in, it turned with a soft click. The door swung open on silent hinges. Inside was a small stone chamber, no bigger than a closet, lined with shelves. Stacks of ledgers, bound bundles of deeds, an old safe sat in the corner. Dust coated everything like snow. At the center of the room stood a wooden table with a single oil lamp beside a thick leather book. I opened the book. The first page was dated 1903, the same year the farmhouse had been built. It recorded every transfer of ownership, every amendment to the trust, every attempted claim. My eyes traced the line of names until I reached the last entry, Custodian Transfer 2024. Granted to new title holder upon lawful purchase. Underneath that line was my own name, typed in fading ink. Someone had updated the record the day I bought the property. My throat tightened. It was proof, written into the original ledger of the trust itself. I wasn't just the owner. I was the legal custodian of the entire estate. Margaret had no claim, no matter what documents she'd forged. The relief came fast and fierce, but it lasted only a second. Because then I noticed the other name written just beneath mine, Margaret Henderson, revoked 1984, for fraud and alteration of trust. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. She'd been trying to rewrite that record ever since she lost it. Above me, the footsteps grew louder. A door slammed. Someone shouted something I couldn't make out. The house groaned as if it were angry. I gathered the ledgers and stuffed them into a burlap sack I found on the floor. Then I reached for the safe. It was heavy and half buried in the dirt, but I managed to drag it free. The lock was old, combination style. My fingers trembled as I spun the dial. The brass key didn't fit, but after a few tries I heard a faint click. Inside the safe were 3 items: an envelope sealed with wax, a small revolver so rusted it was useless, and a stack of photographs. The pictures showed the farmhouse over the years, each decade, each renovation. But in every image, one person remained the same: Margaret. The dates made no sense. A photo from 1974, another from 1990, one from 2003. She looked identical in every one. The same hair, same posture, same eyes. The lantern flickered. I felt something behind me shift, like the air itself exhaled. Then the sound returned. Boots on the basement steps. They'd found the hatch. I stuffed the photos and the sealed envelope into my jacket pocket, grabbed the sack of documents, and turned toward the tunnel's far end. There was another door, a small wooden one, half collapsed, leading outside beneath the barn. I pushed it open and stumbled into the night air. The moon hung low, silver and sharp. The fields were quiet except for the distant whir of crickets. Behind me, the farmhouse windows glowed with flashlight beams moving from room to room. I crept along the fence line, keeping low until I reached my truck parked by the gate. When I looked back, I saw her standing in the doorway, Margaret, framed by the light behind her, perfectly still. For a moment I thought she was a statue. Then she lifted her hand in a slow, deliberate wave. I drove away without headlights until I reached the main road. My hands shook the whole time. The next morning, I met the lawyer again, this time with everything: the trust ledgers, the photographs, the envelope. She examined the records carefully. When she reached the line about the 1984 revocation, her eyebrows shot up. She said if this material was authentic, it could not only overturn the title transfer, but also expose criminal fraud. She broke the wax seal on the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a brass emblem shaped like an oak leaf. The letter was handwritten in neat cursive. To the future custodian. The land must remain outside governance. The one who seeks to reclaim it has already lost her place among the living. Guard this record, for she will return to rewrite what time erased. The lawyer looked at me with confusion, but I couldn't speak. The words swam on the page. She will return. That night, I went back to the farmhouse with a deputy escort to collect the rest of my belongings. The fence was gone, completely. The posts, the tags, everything. The yard looked untouched, like none of it had ever existed. Even the tire tracks had disappeared. Inside, the house smelled like dust and rain. The floors were clean, the furniture back in place, the hatch sealed shut as if it had never been opened. When the deputy searched upstairs, he found nothing. No signs of entry, no footprints, no broken locks. He asked if I was sure anyone had been here. I told him yes. He gave me a sympathetic look. The kind people give when they think you're unraveling. After he left, I sat by the fireplace again, staring at the flame. The farmhouse creaked softly, settling into itself. The brass emblem from the envelope rested on the mantel, gleaming in the firelight. For the first time, the house didn't feel hostile. It felt protective. I thought about leaving, selling the land, walking away from all of it. But something in me couldn't. The house was mine now, in ways I didn't fully understand. The documents proved ownership, but the connection ran deeper than paper. It felt older than that, as if the walls themselves had chosen a new custodian. A week later, the county confirmed that all of Margaret's filings had been voided. The forged title transfer disappeared from the records. The digital boundary lines were restored, and Maple Grove Estates issued a public statement calling it a clerical misunderstanding. Her name was quietly removed from their board roster. No one in the neighborhood had seen her since the night of the hearing. Some said she'd moved. Others claimed she'd passed away years ago, and the HOA had just kept her records active out of habit. I didn't know what to believe. One evening, I decided to explore the basement again. The tunnel door was locked from the inside, the key still hanging in the same spot. I relit the lantern and walked the length of the corridor to the iron door. When I opened it, the archive room was exactly as I'd left it, except for the book on the table. It was open. The last line, written in new ink, read, "Custodian reaffirmed. Henderson Trust endures." My hand trembled as I touched the page. The ink was still wet. I closed the ledger slowly and backed away. The lantern flame flickered, throwing the shadows of the shelves against the stone walls. For a moment, I thought I saw someone standing in the doorway, a faint outline, motionless. The shape of a woman, her hair catching the light, her eyes glinting like glass. I blinked, and the figure was gone. Only the faint smell of lilacs lingered in the air, the same scent I'd noticed the first day she appeared by the creek. When I went upstairs, I locked every door and window. But before turning in, I glanced once more at the fireplace. The brass oak leaf emblem still rested on the mantel, except now, beneath it, lay something that hadn't been there before, an old photograph. It showed the farmhouse exactly as it looked now. Standing on the porch was a man holding the same brass emblem in his hand, and behind him, barely visible in the doorway, was Margaret. The back of the photograph was marked with a single sentence, in handwriting I didn't recognize. "The house always keeps its custodian." I felt the air leave my lungs. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the hearth. Outside, the wind began to rise, rattling the windows and shaking the shutters. The farmhouse seemed to sigh, settling into its bones once again. I should have felt free. The land was mine, the records clear, the nightmare over. But as I turned out the lights and listened to the creaks in the hall, a thought whispered through my mind like the wind through the cornfields. Maybe she hadn't been trying to steal the house at all. Maybe she'd been trying to return it, to make sure someone took her place before she finally disappeared for good. The floorboards above me groaned softly, as though someone were walking the halls, checking every door. I didn't move. I didn't speak, because in that moment, I realized the house was no longer empty. Every night since, I hear those footsteps upstairs, steady, patient, familiar. The house doesn't scare me anymore. But sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I smell lilacs on the wind and hear her voice whisper my name, the same way it echoed through the floorboards that night. Maybe Margaret never left. Maybe she never could. And maybe, just maybe, the farmhouse didn't belong to me at all. It belonged to her.